I'm 88 years old, and for most of my life I carried people inside me like stones in a coat pocket. People who had hurt me, wronged me, left me without explanation or apology. I carried them for decades. And then one morning not long ago, I reached into that pocket and found it empty. My name is George. I am 88 years old. And I want to tell you how that happened, because it didn't happen the way I always thought it would. I always believed that forgiveness would feel like a door closing, a firm, final thing. I imagined that one day the person who hurt me would say the right words, or I would say the right words, and something would click shut cleanly, and I would be free. That is not what happened. Not once. Not with any of them. What happened was something quieter and stranger and much more private than I ever expected. And by the time I understood it, most of the people I had forgiven were already gone. Let me start with my older brother, Harold. Harold was 4 years older than me, and for most of my childhood, he was the person I admired most in the world. He was confident in the way I never was. He walked into rooms and people turned toward him the way you turn toward a window when the sun comes through. I wanted to be near him constantly. I wanted him to see me the way I saw him. When I was 17, Harold was accepted to a university in another city. I remember the dinner where my father announced it. My mother cried from happiness. My father shook his hand at the table. I smiled and I meant it. I was genuinely proud of him. But that same night, lying in the dark of the bedroom we had shared our whole lives, I waited for Harold to say something to me. Something private. Some acknowledgement that this was a change, that things between us would be different now, that he knew I would miss him. He turned off the lamp and went to sleep. He left 3 weeks later, and we never really lived as brothers again after that. It sounds small when I say it out loud. A boy who wanted his brother to say good night before leaving. But that is the thing about the wounds that stay with you the longest. They are almost never the large, dramatic ones. They are the small silences, the turned backs, the moment when someone you loved had the chance to reach toward you and simply did not. I carried that with me for years, longer than I should tell you, honestly, into my marriage, into my friendships, into the way I watched other brothers interact with a kind of distance I told myself was just my personality. Harold and I exchanged letters and then phone calls and then nothing much at all, and I told myself I had accepted it, that it was simply how some people were, that not everyone was built for closeness. But acceptance and forgiveness are not the same thing, and for a long time I confused them completely. My wife, Eleanor, noticed before I did. Eleanor had a way of watching me that was unlike anyone else I have ever known. Not critical, not impatient. She simply watched and waited and eventually said the thing I was not ready to hear, which was her particular gift throughout our marriage. One evening, after a phone call with Harold that had been clipped and practical and entirely without warmth, she sat down across from me and said, "You are still angry at him." Not as an accusation, just as an observation, the way you might say it looks like rain. I told her she was wrong. She nodded and went back to her book. Eleanor was almost never wrong about me. The anger, when I finally let myself look at it directly, was not even the largest part of what I was carrying. Underneath the anger was something more embarrassing, which was grief. I was grieving a brother I had never quite had. I was grieving the version of Harold that I had built in my imagination when I was 12 years old. The one who would have stayed up late talking with me, who would have been the first person I called when something important happened in my life. That Harold did not really exist. He never had. And I had spent 40 years being angry at a man for failing to be someone he had never actually been. I do not know exactly when I understood this. It was not a single moment. It was more like the way your eyes adjust in a dark room. Slowly and then all at once, and by the time you notice you can see, you cannot quite remember when you were blind. I was in my late 60s, I think, sitting in the backyard on a Sunday afternoon with nothing particular on my mind, and I thought about Harold and felt for the first time something closer to sorrow than anger. Sorrow for him, actually, because it occurred to me for the first time that he had probably never known what I needed from him. That he had likely walked through his own life carrying his own version of an empty pocket. That the distance between us had been painful for him in ways he had never had the language to express, because neither of us had that language, really. We were men of a generation that was not taught the language for those things, and the anger just loosened. Not because he apologized, and he never did. Not because I confronted him or we had any conversation that resolved anything between us. We did not. Harold died in his early 80s, and the last time I saw him, we sat in his hospital room and talked about his garden and the weather and a baseball game that had happened 30 years ago, and neither of us said a word about any of it. But by then I did not need us to. The stone was already gone. I want to stop here for a moment because I know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking that what I'm describing is not really forgiveness. You're thinking that I simply convinced myself to stop caring, or that I lowered my expectations of Harold until the hurt no longer reached them. I understand why you might think that. I thought that myself for a long time. But there is a difference, and it matters. And when I stopped being angry at Harold, I did not stop loving him. So, in fact, I think I loved him more clearly than I ever had before, because I was finally seeing him as he actually was, and not as the failure of someone I had needed him to be. That is not lowering your expectations. That is releasing someone from a role you cast them in without their knowledge or consent. Eleanor was sick in the last years of her life, and during that time I thought about forgiveness constantly in a way I never had before, because watching someone you love diminish teaches you things about time that nothing else can. It teaches you how finite everything is, including resentment, including pride. It makes the stones in your pockets feel very heavy and very unnecessary. There was a man I had worked with for 12 years, a colleague named Paul, who had taken credit for something I had done and advanced his career on the back of it, and never once acknowledged it. Not to me, not to anyone. I had carried that for 20 years. During one of those long nights sitting with Eleanor in the hospital, it suddenly seemed to me genuinely absurd that I had given 20 years of interior life to Paul, to his face in my memory, to the imaginary conversations in which I finally said to him the things I should have said. 20 years of a life, given freely to a man who had probably not thought about me in 2 decades. I let it go that night, and not for Paul. Paul is likely still walking around receiving credit for things that do not belong to him. He did not earn my forgiveness, and he did not need it. I let it go for myself. I let it go because Eleanor was sleeping in the chair beside me, and the room was quiet, and I could feel more clearly than I ever had that the time I had was not infinite, and that I was not willing to spend any more of it feeding a resentment that had never in 20 years harmed anyone but me. That is the thing that took me most of my life to understand. That resentment does not travel. You cannot send it back to the person it came from. It lives only inside you, and it costs only you. And setting it down is not something you do for the person who put it there. It is something you do entirely selfishly for yourself. I am not a spiritual man in any formal sense. I have my beliefs, and I hold them quietly, as I think most honest people do. But in my late years, I've come to think of forgiveness as something close to a physical act. Not metaphorically physical, but literally. Like unclenching a fist you forgot was closed. Like finally exhaling a breath you have been half holding for years. You do not need the other person present. You do not need them to understand or to apologize or to change. You do it alone in a quiet room or in a backyard on a Sunday afternoon or at 3 in the morning in a hospital beside someone you love. You do it by simply deciding finally that you are done. I am 88 years old. The list of people I have had reason to forgive is long, as it is for anyone who has lived this many years. And almost none of them know that I have forgiven them. Most of them are gone. Some of them, if they were here, would be confused by the very idea that there was anything to forgive. That used to bother me. It does not anymore. Because forgiveness, I have finally learned, was never a conversation between two people. It was always a conversation between me and myself. It was always about what I was willing to carry and what I was finally willing to set down. If there is someone you are still carrying, I am not going to tell you to forgive them. I am not going to tell you it is easy or fast, or that it will feel the way you expect it to feel. I'm only going to tell you what I know from my own long and imperfect life, which is that the weight of it belongs to you, not to them, and that you are allowed to put it down whenever you are ready. Not for their sake, never for their sake. For the sake of the time you still have left, which is more valuable than any grievance, no matter how honestly it was earned. That is all I know. That is what 88 years have taught me. And on most days it feels like enough.